You know, when you see a really old, like a priceless painting being restored,
Oh, right, yeah.
there is always this intense and sometimes honestly vicious debate in the art world about how you actually go about doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you just, gently clean the surface dust off and leave the cracks? Or do you touch up the faded colors so it looks the way the artist originally intended?
Right, the intentionality argument.
Exactly. Or, and this is the extreme one, do you take a scalpel and meticulously, painstakingly strip away every single layer of varnish, every single touch-up that has been added over the last, say, 1,000 years,
Hmm.
even if that means it leaves the original canvas looking super raw and vulnerable?
Yeah, that's the classic restoration dilemma. It's this fundamental tension between preserving the lived history of an object, right, and attempting to recover its absolute original state.
Yeah.
Because we tend to think that adding a layer of protective varnish keeps a masterpiece safe for future generations, but to a purist, that varnish is a distortion. It alters how the light hits the paint. It changes the colors entirely.
Because every layer of varnish, every microscopic touch-up made by some well-meaning curator in the, I don't know, the 15th century or the 18th century, it changes the painting.
Exactly.
It's just no longer the original.
Yeah.
And in the art world, that's a debate over paint. But today, we're looking at what happens when that exact same restoration debate is applied to human salvation.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. We're
Okay.
looking at a theological landscape that is honestly the most high-stakes restoration project in human history.
It's the absolute definition of an epistemic battleground. Because think about it, when the survival of your soul is on the line, the question of how you protect the original truth from the corrosion of time, well, that becomes the only question that matters.
The only one. Okay, so let's unpack this, because today we are taking a deep dive into the historical, theological, and the psychological foundations of Hanbali and Salafi traditionalism in Islam.
Right.
And we have a massive stack of sources today,
Yeah.
research notes, historical excerpts to go through. And our mission for this deep dive is to really just move past the surface level headlines.
Which is so needed.
Because we hear terms like Salafi or Hanbali thrown around in global news constantly.
Right.
And usually they're completely stripped of context.
Completely.
But how rarely do we actually pause to understand the intellectual machinery behind those words? We want to take a genuine look at what it actually feels like to view the world from inside this incredibly rigorous traditionalist framework.
And to genuinely understand these traditions, I mean, we really have to realize that at their core, they are not about being reactionary just for the sake of being difficult.
Right.
They are fundamentally about a profound, unyielding quest to preserve divine truth across centuries. And that is an immense burden.
I can imagine.
Because when you view your texts as the literal, unadulterated word of God, the stakes of interpretation are infinite.
Infinite, yeah.
So the moment you understand that this is a framework built on an existential fear of corrupting the divine message, well, the entire system begins to make logical sense.
Which brings us to why you, the listener, should care about this, even if you don't have a personal connection to the theology yourself.
Yeah.
Because understanding this framework isn't just about religion.
No, not at all.
It'd have a masterclass in how human beings construct systems of ultimate certainty, discipline, and moral clarity in a world that is just inherently chaotic.
Exactly. It's about how we draw lines in the sand.
Yeah. But to understand why this strict adherence exists today, we have to travel back in time. We have to go to this high-stakes intellectual battleground in 9th century Baghdad.
Oh, Baghdad in the 9th century.
Yeah, so what was actually happening there that set this whole thing in motion?
So Baghdad in the 9th century, during the Abbasid Caliphate, was essentially the intellectual center of the world.
Okay.
Picture a massive cosmopolitan hub. You have the House of Wisdom, which was this grand library and translation center.
Translating what exactly?
Well, scholars were taking ancient Greek philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, and they were translating it into Arabic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and you also had Persian administrative traditions mixing with Islamic theology. So out of this massive collision of ideas, a fierce debate emerged among early Muslims.
What were they arguing about?
The core question was this: should human reason and philosophy shape theology? When we read scripture, can we interpret it metaphorically to fit our rational understanding of the universe?
Okay, and From our sources, it seems like the dominant intellectual trend of the time was driven by a group called the Mutazilites.
Yes.
So who were they and why did they have so much power?
The Mutazilites were essentially the rationalists of their era. They were deeply, deeply enamored with Greek, logic, and philosophy.
Okay.
And they believed that divine revelation could, and frankly should, be harmonized with human reason.
So if there was a conflict between the text and logic.
Right. If a piece of scripture seemed to contradict rational thought, they argued it should be interpreted metaphorically.
Got it.
And this wasn't just, a polite debate happening in the courtyard of a university somewhere. The Mutazilites managed to get the backing of the state.
Oh, that changes things.
Completely. The Abbasid rulers adopted this rationalist approach as state-enforced doctrine.
Wait, so the government is stepping in and telling religious scholars how to think?
Yes, exactly.
Wow, what was the specific breaking point there?
Well, the pivotal historical event here is known as the Mina.
The Mina.
Yeah, which translates roughly to the ordeal or the Inquisition.
Oh, boy.
The Abbasid caliphs actually forced religious scholars to publicly accept a specific theological doctrine.
Which was?
The doctrine that the Quran was created by God in time, rather than being the uncreated eternal word of God that existed outside of time.
Okay, wait, stop there. Because to a modern ear, whether the Quran is created or uncreated sounds like an incredibly abstract theological hair to split.
It does sound like that today, yeah.
Why did the government care enough to start a literal inquisition over it?
Because the implications of that distinction are massive.
Okay, how so?
If the Quran was created at a specific moment in time, it implies it belongs to a specific historical context.
Right.
And if it belongs to a specific context, then human reason can interpret it, mold it, and maybe even supersede it as society evolves.
Oh, I see.
It opens the door to human philosophy acting as an active filter for divine revelation.
And the rulers liked that.
They loved it because it gave them the flexibility to interpret the law as they saw fit for their empire.
Ah, okay. That makes total sense. It's about who controls the narrative.
Precisely.
So into this intense, highly politicized environment steps our central figure of resistance, Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Yes, exactly.
He lived from 780 to 855 CE, and he famously and stubbornly resisted this state-sponsored rationalism. He basically argued that theology must remain faithful only to the textual tradition.
Ahmad ibn Hanbal drew a massive line in the sand. He stated that the Quran and the authentic prophetic traditions, the Hadith, are the ultimate and only authorities.
No philosophy allowed.
Categorically rejected. He rejected the Mutazilite rational theology, and he rejected the use of Greek philosophical speculation to understand God. To him, the Quran was the uncreated word of God, period.
And the state did not take kindly to that.
No, they did not.
Because when we talk about the Mina, this Inquisition, we're talking about the immense pressure of an empire bearing down on individual scholars.
Right, physical pressure.
Imagine being Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Yeah.
You are dragged before the authorities, you are thrown into a dungeon, you are physically beaten and flogged.
It was brutal.
And the authorities are essentially telling you, just agree with the state theology. Just say this one philosophical point makes sense, and you can go home.
Just bend a little.
Right. And he sits there in the dark, choosing imprisonment and torture over compromising a single theological principle. The sources we have describe this moment as forging a faith in the harsh clarity of desert truth.
I love that phrase. The harsh clarity of desert truth captures the psychological endurance of his position beautifully.
Yeah.
Because the core traditionalist argument he established was devastating in its simplicity. Subjecting divine revelation to human philosophy is fundamentally arrogant.
Arrogant.
Yes. The human mind is flawed. Human reason changes based on the century you live in, the culture you were raised in, even the philosopher you happen to be reading at the time. Sure. But revelation is perfect. Therefore, to filter perfection through the flawed, ever-changing lens of human reason is to actively corrupt it.
Okay, I keep thinking about this 9th century debate like a modern source code argument in software development.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, think about it. The Mutazilites, the rationalists, they are essentially arguing for an open source model. They're saying, look, the original code is great, but as the user base grows and the hardware changes over centuries, the community needs to be able to go in, apply human reason, write patches, interpret the code metaphorically, and optimize it for the current environment.
And Ahmad ibn Hanbal is locking the source code.
Exactly. He is standing there saying, no, the original code was written by a flawless, divine developer. You do not touch it. It is absolutely locked. It is read-only.
Read-only. I like that.
If the program crashes, it's not because the code is wrong, it's because your human hardware is flawed. Do not edit the code.
He locked the source code, and that uncompromising stance, well, that made him the ultimate symbol of Orthodox traditionalism.
Right.
He became the founder of the Hanbali legal school. And his intellectual DNA is passed down through centuries to later massively influential figures.
Like who?
Well, you see it in Ibn Taymiyyah in the medieval era. He lived through the trauma of the Mongol invasions and constantly emphasized returning directly to the pristine text.
Okay.
And you see it much later in Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the 18th century revivalist reformer in the deserts of Arabia. His movement heavily influenced modern Salafism. They all share that exact same instinct to protect the unedited code.
But I have to push back here, or at least try to grapple with the logic.
Yeah.
If philosophy, science, and rational debate were the intellectual currency of the time, I mean, if everyone around you in Baghdad is using Greek logic to explore the universe and push humanity forward, isn't Ibn Hanbal's refusal to engage with it a form of intellectual surrender?
That's a very common perspective.
Isn't putting your hands over your ears and saying, I'm only reading the text, a sign of weakness rather than strength?
That is the exact critique leveled against him by his contemporaries. They viewed him as anti-intellectual.
Because he wouldn't debate on their terms.
Exactly. But from the traditionalist perspective, it was the exact opposite of surrender. To them, it was supreme epistemological discipline.
Discipline.
Yes, it takes immense intellectual restraint to look at a complex philosophical puzzle that everyone else is playing with and say, I refuse to use the wrong tools to solve this.
What do you mean by the wrong tools?
Well, the traditionalists argued that human reason and philosophy are excellent tools for measuring the physical world, for building aqueducts, for mathematics, for medicine, but they are entirely the wrong tools for measuring God.
Oh, wow.
To them, engaging in philosophical speculation about the nature of the divine wasn't advanced thinking. It was just finite humans playing arrogant guessing games with the infinite.
That is a fascinating shift in perspective. So this refusal to alter the source code, this total rejection of human philosophy acting as a filter, it wasn't just a historical moment of a guy being stubborn in a Baghdad prison.
No, not at all.
It became the absolute blueprint for every aspect of daily life and core belief in this tradition. So how does that prison debate actually shape what a person believes on a Tuesday morning?
Right. The historical crucible of the Mina forged an architecture of belief that is meticulously structured. If you accept the core premise that the text is perfect and human intervention is flawed, everything else logically follows.
Okay, so what's the foundation?
The foundation of this architecture is Tawhid, which is absolute monotheism. God is one, transcendent, unique, and totally beyond human comparison.
And the sources note that when it comes to the attributes of God mentioned in Scripture, like if the text literally says God has a hand or God sits on a throne, they accept this without any speculative reinterpretation.
That's right.
They don't say, oh, well, hand is clearly just a metaphor for power or generosity. They say the text says hand, we accept it as hand.
They accept it, but with a crucial caveat. They do not compare it to a human hand, and they do not ask how.
They don't ask how.
Exactly. They don't try to explain the mechanics of it. They accept the text as it is, leaving the ultimate reality of it to God.
Wow, okay.
And this strict adherence applies equally to the Quran and the authentic Hadith.
The Hadith being the sayings of the Prophet.
Yes. Specifically, the heavily vetted historical collections of the Prophet's sayings and actions. The purpose of human life, in this worldview, is stripped of all philosophical ambiguity. Worship the Creator, obey divine law, and live according to the prophetic example.
It's very straightforward.
After death, there is resurrection, judgment, paradise, or hell. The clarity is the point.
And because there is no ambiguity, there is this fierce, almost visceral rejection of a concept called bid'ah.
Yes, bid'ah.
This is a crucial term we really need to define for the deep dive. Bid'ah means religious innovation.
Correct.
And we are so conditioned in the modern West to think innovation is the highest possible compliment.
Right. It's a buzzword.
You innovate in tech, you innovate in business. But here, religious innovation is the ultimate danger. Why is it so terrifying to them?
The rejection of bid'ah is the logical defense mechanism for protecting that source code we talked about. This brings us to what we can call the epistemic chain of trust.
Epistemic chain of trust. Okay, we'll walk through that.
This is the internal mathematical proof that governs the mind of the traditionalist believer. Step 1. Divine revelation is perfect.
Okay.
Step 2. The companions of the Prophet Muhammad heard that revelation directly with their own ears without any historical distance.
Makes sense.
Step 3. Therefore, those earliest generations, who are known as the Salaf al-Aliyah, the pious predecessors, they understood the religion best. Step 4. Any later addition, whether it's a new philosophical theory from a university or a new ritual practice from a mystic, introduces distance from the original truth and risks corruption.
Because it wasn't there at the start.
Exactly. The conclusion is absolute. Simplicity equals authenticity.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It is that exact equation, simplicity equals authenticity, that dictates the entire cultural expression of their daily lives.
It permeates everything.
It's not just theology and dusky books. Daily life centers on the 5 pillars: the declaration of faith, the 5 daily prayers, charity, fasting in Ramadan, and the pilgrimage to Mecca. You have the Friday congregational prayer. But what's really striking is what isn't there.
The absence of external adornment is a theological statement in itself.
Yes, because there is no elaborate religious art. There are no massive ornate statues or complex metaphorical architecture. Mosques favor stark simplicity, maybe some calligraphy of Quranic verses, but nothing to distract the eye.
Very minimalist.
If you go to a typical religious gathering, it's not a mystical theatrical ceremony with chanting, drums, and incense. It's studying the Hadith. It's listening to a sermon. It's communal prayer.
Right.
Even the food customs, like breaking fast with dates, sitting on the floor for communal meals, these are about mimicking the exact prophetic tradition, the Sunnah. They are literally trying to map the physical movements of the 7th century onto their daily lives.
They do this because of that epistemic chain of trust. Think about it. To add a grand, ornate shrine over a grave, or to invent a new, emotionally moving, mystical chanting ceremony that might feel incredibly good to the human heart.
Sure, people love that stuff.
But it breaks the chain. It introduces a variable that the Salaf, the pious predecessors, did not practice. Therefore, it is bid'ah. It is a distortion of the original canvas.
Okay, let me bring back my software analogy. I liken this fear of bid'ah to feature creep in a pristine app.
Oh, feature creep, yes.
Imagine you build a perfect, simple, lightning-fast app that does exactly what it needs to do. It's flawless. But then over the decades, new developers come in. One says, hey, what if we added a social feed to the prayer app?
Right.
Another says, what if we added mystical mini-games to make it more engaging? Another says, let's change the interface color to something more emotional to attract a younger demographic.
And suddenly it's a completely different app.
Exactly. Every single new feature they add might seem cool in the moment, but ultimately it bloats the software, it introduces bugs, it slows everything down, and eventually the app crashes, and you can't even find the original core function anymore.
That is a perfect way to describe their fear.
The traditionalist is the original developer screaming, stop adding features, you're breaking the app.
The traditionalists view centuries of cultural accretion, theological philosophy, and local mystical practices as that exact type of feature creep. To them, it obscures the pure, efficient, original faith.
But I have to ask the obvious question here, and I'm genuinely struggling with this. Is absolute literalism actually possible?
Well, that's the debate, isn't it?
Because language itself evolves. Words change meaning over centuries. Contexts shift. How do they take an ancient text literally without inherently adding some human interpretation just to read it?
It's a very fair question.
I mean, even translating a 7th century Arabic text into a modern brain requires interpretive choices. Isn't claiming to be a pure literalist sometimes just an illusion?
That is the exact critique leveled by other Islamic scholars, sociologists, and linguists. They argue that language is inherently fluid.
Right.
The traditionalist counter-argument, however, is that this fluidity is exactly why they rely so heavily on the Salaf, the earliest generations.
Okay, how does that solve the language problem?
Because they aren't just reading the text literally in a vacuum. They are reading the text exactly as the companions of the Prophet interpreted it.
Oh, I see.
They rely on the recorded consensus of those early generations to freeze the meaning of the language in time. So to them, it isn't an illusion. It's a rigorous historical science of verification. They are cross-referencing every interpretation against the historical record of the 7th century.
Wow. But if the goal is to freeze the religion in the 7th century, how do they deal with the centuries of legal rulings that came after? Do they just ignore them?
That depends entirely on which group you're talking about.
Because this strict anti-innovation mindset naturally leads to friction. And not just friction with the modern secular world. It leads to intense friction within the Islamic tradition itself.
Absolutely.
Which brings us to a critical distinction in our sources that outsiders almost always get wrong. The difference between Hanbali and Salafi.
This is a vital nuance. In Western media, you often hear the terms Hanbali and Salafi used interchangeably, as if they are the exact same thing.
All the time.
But they are distinct, both historically and functionally. Let's look at the Hanbali tradition first. Hanbalism is a classical legal school. It is one of the 4 major Sunni schools of jurisprudence, founded by the students of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. It focuses on strict textual adherence, and it minimizes speculative reasoning.
Right.
But historically, Hanbalis were part of the mainstream Sunni pluralism. They debated with the other schools, they formed complex legal precedents over centuries, and they were geographically rooted largely in the Arabian Peninsula. They have a massive library of established legal thought.
So Hanbali is a classical legal school with a long established history of jurisprudence. But Salafism, the sources tell us, is a reformist theological movement.
Yes.
It emerged much later. And what's wild to me is that Salafism often bypasses those traditional classical schools entirely.
It completely sidesteps them.
They don't say, let's look at what the Hanbali scholars said in the 12th century about this issue. They say, let's ignore the 12th century entirely and go straight back to the 7th century.
The radical nature of Salafism's claim is that even the classical legal schools, even the strict Hanbali school itself, might be too cluttered with centuries of human jurisprudence.
It's like sweeping the board clean.
It is a reformist attempt to jump directly over 1,000 years of history. Now, it's important to note some Salafists do follow Hanbali law practically, but others claim to follow no school at all. They rely solely on their own direct reading of the authenticated texts and the actions of the early Salaf.
I think of it like the U.S. Constitution.
Oh, how so?
The Hanbali approach is like being a strict originalist Supreme Court justice.
Oh.
You are looking at the Constitution, but you are also reading all the classical precedent, the major rulings from the 1800s, the established legal tradition that is built up around that strict reading over 200 years.
Right, there's a paper trail.
Exactly. Salafism, on the other hand, is like a citizen walking into the Supreme Court, throwing out all the volumes of historical precedent, firing all the judges and saying, I don't care what any judge said in 1920 or 1850. I am only reading the original piece of paper from 1787, and I'm applying it directly to my life today.
That captures the reformist, almost disruptive energy of Salafism perfectly. It seeks to completely cut out the middlemen of history.
Yeah.
But what we must also understand is that because Salafism is a methodology of reading text, it is not a monolithic group.
Not at all.
When you hand millions of people a text and say, read this directly without the historical schools, they don't all come to the exact same behavioral conclusions in the modern world.
Right. And if they are reading the exact same source code, why do we see such wildly different, sometimes violently opposed behaviors on the news?
Because applying 7th century literalism to the modern world forces different strategic choices. Our sources outline 3 main internal currents within Salafism.
Okay, let's break those down.
The first, and by far the largest, is the quietist Salafists.
Quietist.
Their focus is almost entirely inward and educational. They focus on personal piety, intense religious study, and strict obedience to existing political rulers, regardless of who those rulers are.
They don't get involved in politics at all.
They actively avoid political activism. They believe that getting involved in protests or elections distracts from pure worship, corrupts the soul, and causes societal division. They are building local communities of extreme religious practice while completely ignoring the state.
So they are completely apolitical. What about the ones who aren't?
The second group is the political Salafists. They share the exact same theological framework, but they believe that protecting the faith requires active, structural engagement with modern society.
Like running for office.
Exactly. They are involved in social reform, and in many parts of the Middle East, they actually engage in electoral politics. They form political parties, run for parliament, and try to implement their vision of ethical society through the legislative process.
And then we arrive at the third group, which takes up, frankly, 99% of the Western media coverage. The jihadi Salafists.
Yes. This is the highly infamous, highly visible faction that interprets the concept of jihad in militant, violent ways. They absolutely dominate global news cycles.
They do.
But it is imperative to state clearly what the sources show. While this violent minority draws on similar theological language and textual references, the vast majority of Salafists, the quietists, and the political factions actively and vehemently reject these violent movements.
Really? Vehemently?
Yes, they view the militant factions as having fundamentally misunderstood the texts and having broken the rules of engagement laid out in classical tradition.
That brings up a massive contradiction that I genuinely don't understand about the jihadi Salafists.
What's that?
If the entire premise of your movement is an absolute obsession with avoiding bid'ah, with avoiding religious innovation, how on earth do you justify modern militant tactics that the earliest Muslims never practiced?
That is the big question.
I mean, things like suicide bombings, attacking civilians, or using global digital propaganda networks, aren't those the ultimate, most grotesque forms of innovation? You're using 21st century modern warfare tactics while claiming to be pure 7th century traditionalists.
That is a profound contradiction, and it is exactly the primary critique leveled against them by mainstream traditionalist scholars.
Oh, it is?
Yes. The quietist and Hanbali scholars argue that the militant factions have committed the ultimate bid'ah by innovating the rules of warfare and rebellion, which are very strictly regulated in classical Islamic law.
So they see them as innovators, not traditionalists.
Exactly. The mainstream argument is that the militants have cherry-picked texts to suit a modern reactionary political grievance rather than submitting to the holistic discipline methodology of the Salaf.
Wow. So this rejection of centuries of intermediate scholarship, this attempt to bypass the middleman, creates massive internal fractures. But I'm wondering how the rest of the Islamic world views this literalist approach. Because not everyone agrees that the source code should be read without help.
They absolutely do not. When we look at the broader Islamic landscape, we see very different theories on how to protect the faith. Our source material uses a brilliant framework to explain this.
The safeguards framework.
Right. It looks at the different traditions not just as historical accidents, but as deliberate safeguards. Every major religion eventually has to ask itself a terrifying question. How do we preserve divine truth across centuries of human fallibility?
So what does that look like in practice for the other major groups?
Let's examine the four main paradigms. First, we have traditional Sunni orthodoxy, specifically the Ash'ari and Maturidi theological schools. Historically, they represent the vast majority of Sunni Muslims.
Okay.
They looked at the debate in Baghdad and found a middle ground. Their approach is to accept philosophical reasoning and metaphorical interpretation, but within strict boundaries.
And what's their safeguard?
Their safeguard against corruption isn't just the raw text. Their safeguard is classical scholarly consensus. Over centuries, thousands of scholars debate, refine, and agree on legal and theological positions. That consensus becomes the protective wall.
So they build a massive intellectual structure to protect the truth. What about Sufism?
Sufism takes a very different angle. It emphasizes spiritual purification, inner transformation, and the constant remembrance of God. They focus heavily on the mystical experience.
Right, the inner journey.
Exactly. They often follow spiritual teachers, and their practice can involve poetry, chanting, and shrine visitation. For a Sufi, the ultimate safeguard isn't found merely in a book or a legal ruling. The true safeguard is the inner, lived spiritual experience of the awakened heart.
Which, of course, the Salafists vehemently reject as a dangerous innovation.
Oh, completely.
And then we have Shia Islam, which carries a completely different emotional and historical weight.
Yes, Shia Islam represents a massive theological divergence regarding authority. Shia Muslims believe that leadership after the Prophet Muhammad rightfully belonged to his family, specifically his cousin and son-in-law Ali.
Right.
Therefore, they have a highly centralized clerical authority. They believe in imams who possess divinely guided, infallible spiritual authority, including the concept of a hidden 12th imam, al-Mahdi, who will return to restore justice.
The sources mention that the emotional tone of Shia Islam is very different, too.
Profoundly different. Shia Islam is deeply focused on sacred history, particularly the profound suffering, injustice, and martyrdom experienced by the Prophet's family at the Battle of Karbala.
So their safeguard is different.
The safeguard for Shia Islam is a divinely guided, infallible lineage. They trust the bloodline and the spiritual authority invested in it to protect the truth.
Okay, I have an analogy for this. Trying to synthesize these four massive worldviews, I'm picturing four people who have been tasked with protecting a priceless, glowing diamond, which represents the divine truth.
I like this. Go on.
So the traditional Sunni orthodoxy looks at the diamond and says, we must protect it by building a massive, heavily fortified vault around it, guarded by centuries of scholars debating the best locking mechanisms and alarm systems.
Right, the scholarly consensus.
Exactly. Then the Shia takes the diamond and hands it to a very specific, trusted family lineage, believing only their bloodline has the divine guidance and historical right to hold it safely through the generations.
The infallible lineage.
Yeah. Then the Sufi looks at the diamond and says, "You're all missing the point. The diamond isn't an external object to be locked away. The diamond is a light that actually lives inside your own heart. You just have to do the spiritual work to uncover it."
The inner experience.
Right. And finally, the Salafi walks up, looks at all of them, and says, "Are you all crazy? Just leave the diamond exactly where we found it in the dirt. Don't touch it. Don't build a vault over it because the vault obscures it. Don't move it, and definitely don't pretend it's inside you. Just look at it exactly as it is."
That visualization captures the epistemological divide perfectly. It really highlights that these divisions aren't merely political squabbles on a map. They are fundamentally different theories of knowledge and authority.
They really are.
If you contrast the emotional tones of these traditions, the difference is striking. Think about the profound communal grief commemorated by Shia Muslims during Ashura, weeping for the martyrdom of Hussein.
He's very emotional.
It is a deeply emotive, narrative-driven spirituality that connects the believer to God through historical tragedy. Now contrast that with the Salafi emotional tone, which rejects shrine veneration entirely and prioritizes a strict, unadorned, stoic adherence to prophetic law.
But doesn't leaving the diamond in the dirt, so to speak, have a cost?
In what way?
Well, by stripping away all mystical experience, by banning shrine visits, by removing the emotional, almost romantic connection to the divine, doesn't traditionalism risk turning a vibrant, living faith into a dry, bureaucratic checklist of rules? Doesn't it become just a list of do this, don't do that, without any soul?
If you view it purely from the outside as a list of restrictions, it certainly appears dry. But to truly understand its staying power, we have to completely flip our perspective.
Okay, flip it how?
That question of whether the faith becomes dry brings us to the most fascinating part of our research, the unique psychological profile of the people who do not find it dry at all. In fact, they find it deeply liberatingly meaningful.
Because people are converting to this tradition today, right now, in modern Western cities. It's not just an inherited tradition in the Middle East. And to understand why, we have to look at their view of human nature. Our sources mention the concept of fitra. What is that?
Fitra is the belief that humans are created with a natural, inborn disposition toward the truth. We are born recognizing our creator.
Like an innate compass.
Exactly. However, the human condition dictates that we are also heavily prone to arrogance, temptation, and forgetfulness. We constantly drift from that natural state.
And the solution to this constant drifting, in their view, isn't to search your feelings or have a mystical experience.
No, not at all.
The solution is returning to the revelation via strict discipline and tawbah, which means repentance.
The appeal of this framework becomes incredibly clear when you look at why people actively choose it. Converts are often driven by a desire for absolute certainty in a chaotic world. They want historical authenticity. I want the real thing. Right. Many converts or young Muslims returning to the faith are actively rejecting what they see as watered-down, culturally compromised, or ethnic versions of the religion they grew up with. They crave intellectual rigor over emotional sentiment.
Our research notes actually gave us a fascinating psychological archetype to help understand this. Let's call it the Devon archetype.
Ah, yes, Devon.
Devon represents a highly disciplined strategist seeking redemption. This is a personality profile that absolutely despises hypocrisy.
They can't stand it.
They look at the modern world and see moral relativism everywhere, and they hate it. They pursue truth relentlessly. And crucially, the Devon archetype believes that redemption is earned through concrete action, physical repetition, and moral rigor, rather than sweeping emotional declarations.
If we explore the internal mind of a follower fitting this archetype, it shifts our entire understanding of what meaning is. For this personality, meaning does not come from a fleeting mystical high or a feeling of spiritual euphoria at a retreat. Meaning comes from obedience. It comes from maintaining your moral integrity when no one is looking. It comes from community accountability.
That's a very different kind of fulfillment.
Exactly. Their primary fear is not a lack of emotion. Their primary fear is falling into religious innovation, neglecting divine guidance, and facing moral accountability before God on the day of judgment, having squandered their life on trivialities.
I want to walk you, the listener, through what this actually looks like on the ground. Imagine a day in the life of a modern convert living in an urban Western city.
Right. Picture the environment.
Think about the sheer chaos of modern life today. We have endless, paralyzing consumer choices. We live in a soup of moral ambiguity where nothing is definitively right or wrong.
It's exhausting.
We are constantly battered by digital noise, social media algorithms, notifications, and breaking news. Your brain is essentially under constant siege.
That's a great way to describe it.
And then, right in the middle of that chaos, the alarm goes off for one of the 5 daily prayers. You stop everything. You leave the digital noise. You perform a specific physical ablution, washing your hands, face, and feet. You stand, you bow, you prostrate, reciting the exact same Arabic word that have been recited for 1,400 years.
The exact same word.
In that moment, the chaos vanishes. It provides an anchor of absolute, unbreakable clarity. To an outsider, it looks rigid. But to the Devon archetype, it's not a cage. It's a life raft.
It maps perfectly onto specific human instincts. While some humans crave the freedom of interpretation, others possess a deep, primal craving for structure and certainty.
Yeah, we're all wired differently.
They hold a profound psychological belief that true transformation does not happen because you had a breakthrough in therapy or a good cry. True transformation requires physical repetition. It requires choosing discipline over impulse, day after day, prayer after prayer.
It reminds me of an elite athlete seeking out a coach. The Devon archetype doesn't want the laid-back coach who says, just go out there, have fun, and feel the flow of the game.
Right, that would be more akin to the Sufi approach, feeling the inner light.
Exactly. This archetype wants the strictest, most demanding coach in the league. They want the coach who stands there with a stopwatch, a clipboard, and absolutely zero tolerance for excuses or sloppy footwork. Because they fundamentally believe that greatness, or in this case, spiritual redemption, is only actually achieved through that brutal, uncompromising rigor.
And that rigorous approach builds a profound sense of identity and belonging. When you submit to that level of discipline and you do it alongside a local community of people who are making the exact same demanding choices, the bond is incredibly strong.
You're in it together.
You are no longer drifting in the sea of modern ambiguity. You are anchored.
But I have to ask about the psychological danger here.
Oh.
If the focus is so incredibly heavy on outward repetition, on ensuring you don't commit a technical error in your practice, on constantly monitoring yourself and others for beta, can you become so obsessed with the mechanics of the prayer, making sure your hands are placed exactly right, that you forget the transcendent God you're supposed to be praying to? Doesn't the discipline risk replacing the divinity?
That is the perpetual internal struggle of the traditionalist. It is a danger recognized and debated extensively even within their own ranks.
Well, they talk about it.
Yes, the most astute scholars within the tradition constantly warn against dry literalism that lacks inner sincerity. They emphasize that the physical discipline must be paired with ikhlas, which means absolute sincerity of the heart.
Ikhlas.
But the structural risk is always there. When your primary safeguard is mechanical accuracy and textual literalism, the human tendency is to eventually mistake the mechanism for the goal itself.
Which brings us to a fascinating synthesis of everything we've talked about today. We've gone on quite a journey.
We really have.
We started with a 9th century intellectual rebellion, picturing Ahmad ibn Hanbal sitting in a Baghdad dungeon, refusing to let philosophy alter the source code of his faith. And we've traced that exact same instinct all the way to a modern-day psychological framework for people seeking ultimate moral clarity in a noisy digital world.
And what becomes brilliantly clear is that the major divisions in Islam, the Sunni scholarly vaults, the Shia sacred lineages, the Sufi inner journeys, and the Salafi literalist anchors, they are not just ancient, dusty history.
Not at all.
They are active, living theories on how humans protect what they hold most sacred. They are epistemological survival strategies.
And that challenges you, the listener, directly, because whether you are deeply religious, fiercely atheist, or somewhere in between, you likely have your own safeguard for truth.
Everyone does.
You have your own version of the source code. Maybe your absolute truth is the scientific method and peer review. Maybe it's your own inner intuition and lived experience. Maybe it's the moral consensus of your community or your chosen political tribe. Whatever it is, you have to ask yourself, how do you protect your own core truths from the corrosion of time? How do you prevent feature creep in your own moral operating system?
And if we look forward, it leaves us with a final, rather provocative implication to consider.
What's that?
Well, traditionalism, by its very definition, is built on the unwavering premise that the 7th century, the era of the Salaf, holds all the necessary blueprints for human existence.
Right, the perfect era.
But as we hurtle at breakneck speed toward a future dominated by artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, neural implants, and entirely digital realities,
Yeah.
these are existential issues the pious predecessors could never have conceptualized, let alone spoken about.
They couldn't have even dreamed of it.
So the question becomes, how will a system designed with its eyes fixed purely backward navigate a future that has absolutely zero historical precedent?
How do you lock the source code when the hardware of humanity itself is fundamentally changing? It makes you wonder about that painting we talked about at the beginning.
It does.
You can meticulously strip away all the varnish. You can get it back to the exact, raw, original 7th century brushstrokes. But what happens when you take that perfectly restored ancient canvas and you have to hang it in a room lit entirely by neon and lasers? It's a question that is going to define the next century of theological debate. Something to think about the next time you hear these terms on the news.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.